The library at Aldenmere Hall was the kind of room that did not invite lingering. Its shelves climbed to a ceiling too high for candlelight to fully reach, and the air inside carried the particular cold of a place that was used for work rather than comfort. Eleanor Marsden had been inside it perhaps a dozen times in her 4 months of service, always briefly, always carrying something. A letter to be set on the correspondence tray, a decanter returned from the drawing room, a forgotten pair of gloves the Duke had left on the reading table, and which Mrs. Pottle had dispatched her to retrieve with the brisk efficiency that governed all things in the house. She was not a person who lingered in the library. She was not a person who lingered anywhere that was not hers to occupy. She had no intention of lingering now. It was 3:30 in the afternoon of the 4th of October, and the light through the long windows was already beginning to pale and flatten, the way it did in autumn when the afternoon surrendered early. She was carrying a tea tray intended for the correspondence room at the end of the south corridor, having been redirected by a footman who believed the Duke had moved there to work. He had not. The correspondence room was empty. Eleanor had retraced her steps and was now crossing the library to reach the back passage that connected to the kitchens, because it was shorter and because her right shoe had worn thin at the heel and the extra walk mattered. She was 2 steps past the reading table when she saw it. The document lay open beside the inkwell, the way papers lay when the hand that wrote them had just risen. The wax seal was pressed, the ribbon folded back, the date written at the top in a precise hand. The 4th of October, 1815. The ink on the final line was still dark with moisture. Eleanor's eyes moved across it without intention, the habit of a woman who had grown up among papers, whose father had been a clerk before the accusation and the shame and the silence that followed. She saw the name of the property in the settlement clause. She knew that property. She had heard Mrs. Pottle speak of it 2 weeks prior. The Fenwick letter, the conveyance that had been made to settle the debt owed to a family whose son had died in the Duke's regiment. She had heard the housekeeper say that Aldenmere lands were not to be spoken of above stairs, but property given in settlement of that kind did not come back. She had not understood why it mattered then. She understood now. The document under the Duke's seal promised Lady Cecily Ashford's family that same property as the basis of the settlement. The property the Duke no longer owned. The signature at the bottom was his. The ink still wet enough to take a print if she had pressed her thumb to it, which she did not. She stood with the tea tray level in both hands and read 3 more lines and understood. With the cold clarity of a woman who had grown up learning to see what was not meant for her, that the betrothal the entire household had spent a week preparing for was built on paper that could not stand. She heard the door. Eleanor did not move. She could not have explained afterward why she did not turn, only that there was no version of turning in which she did not appear to be exactly what she was. A maid standing over a private document in a room she had no authority to linger in. She fixed her eyes on the passage door across the room and walked toward it at the pace she had entered, unhurried, her back straight, the tray entirely level. "Miss Marsden?" His voice was low and even, without accusation, without the particular sharpness that the dowager's voice carried when it named her. She stopped. She had no choice but to stop. "Your Grace," she said, and turned. Edward Cavendish, Duke of Aldenmere, stood in the doorway of his own library, with his coat still on from the outdoors, his dark hair wine-touched, his eyes moving from her face to the document on the table, and then back to her face. He was not a man who expressed alarm. In the 4 months she had been in the house, she had seen his face move through a range that began at composed and ended at composed, with occasional stops at a contained and private grief that was not hers to interpret. He looked at her now with something she could not name, which was not accusation. "The correspondence room," she said. "I was misdirected. I took the short passage." He looked at the document again, briefly. "You read quickly," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor held the tray and did not look away. "My father was a clerk," she said. "I read what I see." There was a silence of several seconds. The pale October light lay across the library floor between them, cold and exact. "Set the tray in the hall," he said. "And say nothing." She went. She did not know, as she walked the passage and set the tray on the hall table and climbed the back stairs to the room she shared with the under-housemaid, whether his command was protection or merely a practical instruction from a man who had been inconvenienced. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned over everything she was not supposed to have seen, looking for the shape of it. By the time she reached the top of the stairs, the broken seal had fallen from the edge of the table, where someone had pushed the ribbon aside, and she had picked it up without thinking, and it was in her apron pocket, and she did not take it out again. She had been in service at Aldenmere Hall since the 2nd week of June, having come with a letter of character from the household of a Lady Pemberton in Derbyshire, where Eleanor had been employed as an undermaid and occasional reader before Lady Pemberton's daughter married and consolidated the staff. Mrs. Pottle had looked at the letter for a long time and then looked at Eleanor for a shorter time and told her that the requirements of the position were discretion, steadiness, and the ability to be invisible in a room that did not belong to her. Eleanor had said she understood. She did understand. She had spent most of her life practicing it. The household at Aldenmere was not a cruel one. Which she had come to understand was not the same as a warm one. The Duke's son Thomas was 4 years old and lived in the nursery wing with a nursemaid named Agnes and a succession of tutors who had not yet stayed long enough to become fixtures. Thomas was a small boy with dark eyes like his father's and a careful, watchful quality about him that made Eleanor think he had learned early to be quiet in rooms that did not ask him to speak. She brought him warm milk in the evenings when Agnes was below stairs, because Mrs. Pottle had asked her to, and because the child had once reached up and touched her hand when she set the cup down. Not for any reason she could name, only because the gesture was small and real in a house built for larger gestures. The Duke had inherited Aldenmere at 28, married at 30, and lost his wife Helena at 31 in the way that women were lost in those years, which was to say in the way that was not spoken of above or below stairs with any particular frankness. The house still carried the quality of that loss, not in dramatic visible form, but in small, specific ways. The pianoforte in the music room stood with its lid down and a fine layer of dust on the fallboard. The portrait in the upper corridor had been turned to face the wall. The way Thomas's name sometimes crossed his father's face produced an expression that was not joy and not grief exactly, but the combination of both that a person wore when they could not afford either. The Dowager Duchess Lady Harriet Cavendish had arrived at Aldenmere 3 weeks earlier from her dower house in Somerset, with 2 footmen, a personal maid, and the unshakable confidence of a woman who has managed one great house and intends to manage another. She had assessed the household in 48 hours, pronounced it adequate, and then set about the business that had brought her. The matter of her son's remarriage she treated as a logistical undertaking of no particular emotional complexity in the way she treated most things. The Ashfords were the proximate solution. Lord Ashford had 3 daughters and a reasonable estate and connections that would benefit the Cavendish name in ways Lady Harriet had explained to her son in terms of county alliances and parliamentary seats. Lady Cecily was the eldest and the most accomplished and had the particular quality of looking directly at a room and finding it acceptable. She was not unkind. Eleanor had formed the opinion, watching her from doorways and corridors, that Lady Cecily had been told her entire life that she was exactly the correct choice for any situation, and had come to believe it with the simple faith of a woman whose experience had never presented contrary evidence. It was on the evening of the 5th of October, the day after the library, that Eleanor first heard herself named. She was standing against the wall of the drawing room with a tray of glasses, present to replenish as required, which meant present and not present in the particular way of servants at social gatherings. Lady Harriet sat with Lady Cecily on the settee nearest the fire, speaking in the low voice of women conducting business while performing conversation. Lady Cecily had asked a question about the arrangements for the announcement, and Lady Harriet had waved a hand in the direction of the tray. "Do not trouble yourself before the maid," Lady Harriet said, her voice lowering by a single careful register. "She will hear and speak of it below stairs, which is how these things come to be complicated." Lady Cecily had glanced at Eleanor with the brief, comfortable glance of a woman looking at furniture, and then glanced away. Eleanor stood with her tray and was invisible, which she had practiced, and looked at a point on the wall above their heads, and did not think about the document in the library, or the seal in her apron pocket, or what she had read. She had told herself since the afternoon before that she had nothing of any use to offer. A woman in service carried trays and read quickly and said nothing. And her father's fate had proven what happened when persons without standing spoke truths that persons with standing preferred silent. The seal was still in her pocket. She did not know why she had not left it somewhere. She would not have known about the letter to Mr. Fenwick if Mrs. Pottle had not been agitated that evening at supper, speaking of the arrangements for the ball in the clipped, overcrowded manner that Mrs. Pottle adopted when she was managing too many things at once. The ball was to be held on the 15th. The announcement would be made there. Lord Ashford had written to confirm the date and to note his solicitor's expectation that the formal documents were already dispatched. Mrs. Pottle had said the Duke's secretary had managed the correspondence and had then gone quiet in the particular way that meant she had already said more than she intended. And Eleanor had looked at her plate. She thought about the settlement clause for 3 days before she admitted to herself what she was thinking about. She was thinking about what it meant that the announcement was in 11 days, and that the document she had read contained a flaw that would not survive legal scrutiny once the Ashford family solicitor examined the settlement in detail, and that the Duke had apparently not corrected it, and that the public declaration would be made at the ball on the 15th, and that a public declaration made at a ball was not the same as a signed document, but it was the kind of declaration that, once made, produced consequences independent of the document's validity. She was thinking that a man who had instructed his secretary to manage the correspondence and who had told Eleanor to say nothing might be a man who was managing a problem she did not fully understand. Or he might be a man who had not yet managed it and was running short of time. She was thinking that it was not her business. She was thinking about her father, who had also known something that was not his business, and had also said nothing, and had also found that his silence served a man who never noticed it and destroyed the man who practiced it. The nursery was on the 3rd floor, and Thomas had been troubled with a cough for several days that Agnes attributed to the October damp coming in under the window frames. Eleanor had taken to sitting with him in the early afternoons, while Agnes managed other duties, reading from a small collection of illustrated histories that had been placed in the nursery with no apparent expectation of their being used. Thomas preferred the ones with ships. He would lean against her arm with the focused gravity of a child who understood that the stories ended and needed to be attended to before they did. She was reading to him on the afternoon of the 8th, 3 pages into an account of a naval engagement off a Portuguese coast, when she heard the door. She did not look up immediately. The Duke of Aldenmere stood in the doorway of his son's nursery, with his coat off and his cravat slightly loosened, which was the only version of informality she had seen him permit himself. He looked at his son first, with the expression she had not been able to name, the one that was not joy and not grief, but the combination of both. Thomas looked up from the page and said, quietly, "Miss Eleanor is reading about the ships," with the seriousness of a child reporting important information. The Duke sat down in the chair beside the window, without being asked or asking permission of anyone, because it was his house. He did not ask her to continue. He did not ask her to stop. Eleanor looked at the page and read the next line. She read 3 more pages before Thomas fell asleep against her arm. She set the book down carefully and extracted her arm with the practiced ease of someone who had done it before, and stood and found that the Duke had not moved and was watching her. "He sleeps better when he has been read to," she said, because it was true, and because it was safer than silence. "I know," said the Duke. He looked at his son for a moment longer, and then at the wall above the nursery door, and his face held the particular still quality of a man composing something he had not decided yet whether to speak. "His mother used to read to him," he said, "before he was old enough to understand the words." Eleanor stood with the book in her hands and did not say anything. She read to him because she said, "Even before they understand the words, they understand the presence," he said. "The being there." He paused. "Helena was often correct about things I was slow to see." It was the first time she had heard him say the name aloud. It was the first time she had heard him speak of his wife to anyone who was not himself. She was standing in a nursery with a sleeping child and a man who had just given her the most private sentence she had heard in 4 months of service, and her hand was in her apron pocket without her having told it to go there, and her fingers found the broken seal that had sat there for 4 days. "Your Grace," she said, and then stopped, because she did not know what came after it that would not cost her the position she could not afford to lose. He looked at her. "What do you know?" he said without any particular emphasis, as if it were a continuation of the conversation, rather than a new one. "I know what I read," she said. "I cannot unknow it." He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "I do not suppose you can." He looked at his son. "Mr. Fenwick has the matter in hand. The correction will be made before the announcement." Eleanor turned the seal in her fingers. "And if the announcement is made before the correction is confirmed?" she said, which was not her business, and which she said anyway. He looked at her with something she could not fully read. "It will not be," he said. It was said in the voice that was meant to close questions, and it did. Eleanor bobbed a curtsy and left. She wanted to believe him. She found, as the days passed, and the house filled with arriving guests, and the kitchens became a controlled chaos of preparation, and the upper corridor filled with the sound of Lady Harriet directing footmen with the precision of a general arranging artillery, that belief was becoming harder to sustain. The preparation for the autumn ball at Aldenmere consumed the household from the 12th onward. Lady Harriet had assembled the guest list herself, which comprised 42 persons of sufficient standing to constitute a proper audience for an announcement, and had overseen the arrangement of the ballroom and the dining table, and the supper arrangements with the pleasurable energy of a woman doing what she was built for. Lady Cecily had brought her personal maid and 2 trunks of gowns, and moved through the house with the composed certainty of a woman who already knew its dimensions. It was on the afternoon of the 13th that Eleanor tried once to speak. She had been asked to carry a note to Lady Cecily's room from the Dowager, and she had knocked and entered and set the note on the dressing table as directed, and had been turning to leave when Lady Cecily looked up from the mirror and said, with the casual authority of a woman speaking to furniture that had inconveniently shifted, "Is there something else?" Eleanor had stood with her hands clasped and thought about what she was permitted to say, which was nothing, and what she was not permitted to say, which was everything, and had almost, for a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, said it anyway. "No, my lady," she said. Lady Cecily looked at her for a moment, with the assessing gaze of a woman who was accustomed to reading rooms. "You are the maid who has been unsettling the staff," she said. "My mother-in-law-to-be has mentioned it. If you have concerns about your position, you should speak to Mrs. Pottle." Eleanor held herself very still. "Yes, my lady," she said. She was almost at the door when Lady Cecily said, with perfect pleasantness, "You are a maid. These matters are not yours to understand." The remark was not malicious. It was simply true in the world Lady Cecily had been given to live in. Eleanor went down the back stairs and stood in the passage for a moment, and breathed and felt the seal in her pocket with the tip of one finger, and thought about her father. She found Mrs. Pottle in the still room that evening, when the rest of the staff had dispersed to their suppers. "Is the Duke's secretary in contact with Mr. Fenwick?" she said. "About the settlement documents?" Mrs. Pottle looked at her for a long time. "That is above your station," she said, which was not a no. "I know it is," Eleanor said. The housekeeper set down the jar she was holding with more care than it required. "The secretary departed for London yesterday morning," she said. "The Duke sent him on other business." She said it in the way that people say things they understand to mean something they cannot follow, all the way to its end. Eleanor went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought about the timeline. The secretary was in London. Mr. Fenwick had not confirmed. The ball was in 2 days. The announcement was to be made after the dancing, before supper, in front of 42 people of consequence. A public announcement between a duke and a lady of good family, witnessed by 42 persons, was not the same as a legal document. A promise spoken in a room full of people assembled specifically to hear it became its own form of binding, independent of any instrument that preceded it. She got up and dressed, and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about standing to speak and what it cost. She had been called to Mrs. Pottle's office on the morning of the 14th, and been told, with the particular gentleness that Mrs. Pottle used when delivering difficult information, that her services would not be required after the month's end. Lady Harriet, who would be taking a more permanent role in the management of the Aldenmere household upon the engagement being formalized, had reviewed the staff and found certain adjustments desirable. Eleanor was to receive a full month's wages and a letter of character. There was nothing Mrs. Pottle could say more than she had said. Eleanor had thanked her. She had gone back to her room and sat with the seal in her palm, the small lead disc, and thought about the fact that she was leaving regardless of what she did or did not say. She thought about the document and the settlement clause, and a man who had told her the matter was in hand. She thought about 42 people assembling on the evening of the 15th to witness a declaration that would become its own kind of binding, while a secretary sat in London and a solicitor waited for papers that had not been sent. She thought about her father's name, which no one had cleared. She thought about what it meant to be the only person in a room who had seen something, and to say nothing, because you did not have the standing to be heard. The ball at Aldenmere was held on the evening of the 15th of October, and the ballroom was, as the ballrooms of great houses were in that season, a room arranged specifically to demonstrate the weight of the occasion. The chandeliers had been lit to their full 47 candles each, and the light fell across the assembled guests in the warm, slightly gilded way that candlelight did when it was multiplied sufficiently to become a statement. The musicians were positioned at the far end. The dancers moved through the opening sets with the practiced ease of people who had been doing this since they were 17, and understood the steps as well as their own names. Eleanor moved through the periphery of the room with a tray of glasses, refilling and removing as required, which meant she was present and not present, which was the arrangement she had spent 4 months perfecting. She wore her plain dark dress and her apron and her worn shoes and moved through the edges of the room with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had learned to fit herself to corners. She could see the dais at the far end where the announcement would be made. Lady Harriet stood beside it with the satisfaction of a woman who has arranged a room precisely to her intentions and now needs only for time to catch up. Lady Cecily stood with her family in the third cluster from the windows, in a gown of pale blue that was exactly the correct choice for every element of the occasion. The Duke of Aldenmere stood near the terrace doors with 2 men Eleanor recognized as county acquaintances, his posture carrying the quality it always carried at social events, which was not precisely comfortable and not precisely stiff, but the quality of a man who understood his function in a room and was performing it with precision and without evident pleasure. He had not looked at her once in the 2 days since the nursery. She was passing behind a cluster of guests near the supper-room entrance when she heard it. 2 gentlemen, not young, speaking with the comfortable authority of men accustomed to having their observations treated as observations. "The maid has been spreading unease among the staff, I understand," said one. "Harriet mentioned it. Some displaced clerk's daughter who got above herself." "They always do, in a house where the master is distracted," said the other, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never considered that the observation might be heard. Eleanor continued past them with her tray level. She was near the far wall, collecting empty glasses, when she understood that the musicians had softened and that Lady Harriet had moved to the dais and that the moment of announcement was near. She looked up. The room was shifting in its orientation, the way rooms did when they sensed they were about to be gathered into an audience. 42 faces were arranging themselves toward the dais with the practiced attentiveness of people who knew what they had been invited to witness. She looked at the Duke. He was standing with one hand at his side and his face composed into the particular arrangement it held at public moments, and she could see, from the angle at which she stood against the wall, that he was looking at his mother's position at the dais, and that something in the set of his jaw was not right. It was not the grief expression. It was the expression she had not yet seen on his face, which was the expression of a man who has run out of time and is calculating at high speed what he has left to spend. She could not have said what made her move. She did not analyze it. She set her tray on the side table against the wall, which was not its proper place, and she walked across the ballroom. She did not walk fast. She walked at the measured pace of a woman carrying nothing, because she was carrying nothing. And walking quickly across a ballroom with 42 people in it was not invisible. She kept her eyes on his face. He saw her. She saw him see her. And she saw, in the small tightening of the muscles at the corner of his eye, that he understood what she was about, which was something she could not be certain of, and did not examine. She reached the place where he stood with 2 steps of distance still between them. He crossed both steps. She did not speak. She put her hand in her apron pocket and held out the small lead seal on her open palm, and looked at him, and he looked at it. "Mr. Fenwick?" she said very quietly. "He has not confirmed." The Duke looked at the seal for a moment. His face had not changed, and had changed entirely, in the way that faces changed when they had been composed around a decision that had just become a different decision. He looked up at her, and she looked back at him steadily, the way she had looked at him across the library with a tea tray 4 months before, and a document still wet on the table. And he said very quietly, "No, he has not." Lady Harriet had turned toward the room and begun to speak. The pleasant, carrying voice of a woman opening proceedings. The Duke did not look at the dais. He put 2 fingers against Eleanor's palm, briefly, and closed her hand around the seal. And then he walked across the room. He did not walk with haste. He walked with the unhurried authority of a man who owned the room and understood its dimensions, and the guests parted for him with the unconscious instinct of people in the presence of rank. And when he reached the dais, he put his hand lightly on his mother's arm and said something close to her ear. And Lady Harriet stopped speaking. The room paused. It was not a dramatic pause. It was simply the room noticing that something was happening that was not what had been arranged. Lord Ashford had stepped forward with the expression of a man whose understanding of the schedule was being contradicted. Edward Cavendish turned and faced him, and the room, with the full ease of a man who had navigated rooms like this since he was 20, and said in the level voice that did not need to be raised to carry, that the announcement they had anticipated must be deferred, that a matter of the settlement required the attention of solicitors before any declaration could be made in good faith, that he intended to honor his obligations to the Ashford family in full, and that he would communicate directly with Lord Ashford regarding the timeline for the corrected documents. Lady Harriet had gone still. Lady Cecily had gone still. The room had gone the particular still of 42 people recalibrating what they were witnessing. Lord Ashford said, with the controlled voice of a man whose dignity required him not to appear as surprised as he was, that he would expect the Duke's communication promptly. "You will have it," the Duke said. There was a small additional pause, of the kind that rooms produced when they had been assembled to see one thing, and had seen a different thing, and were not yet certain what judgment to form. The Duke turned then, and his eyes crossed the room with the particular directness of a man who has decided what he is looking for, and found Eleanor against the wall near the side table, where she had set her tray. The room saw where he looked. Into the silence that had not fully resolved, in a voice that carried the register it needed to carry in a room that had been told to listen, he said, "She saw what no one else was willing to see." 12 words. He did not elaborate. Lady Harriet's fan did not move. Lady Cecily's expression had a quality Eleanor had not seen in it before, which was the quality of a woman receiving information her experience had not prepared her to interpret. The 2 gentlemen near the supper-room entrance had stopped their conversation. The musicians had stopped playing some time before, and had not resumed. Eleanor stood by the wall with the seal in her closed hand, and did not look away. What followed happened in the particular proceduralized way of Regency public life, which was to say in the form of polite social management, administered at sufficient volume for 42 witnesses to understand its substance. Lord Ashford withdrew his party from the ballroom within the quarter hour, with the contained dignity of a family that would conduct its displeasure in private, which was the correct form, and which Eleanor understood as neither victory nor defeat, but simply the machinery working in a different direction than it had been assembled to move. Lady Harriet said nothing of any consequence within Eleanor's hearing for the remainder of the evening, which was itself a form of speech she could read. The guests did not depart immediately. They moved through the supper-room and the drawing-room with the slightly elevated alertness of people who had witnessed something they would discuss for weeks, which was not unkind, only human. Mrs. Pottle managed the remainder of the evening with the unruffled competence that was her most essential quality. Mr. Fenwick arrived from Bath the following morning, having been written to in some urgency the week before by a route Eleanor did not know. The settlement documents were reviewed. The property clause was corrected. The Ashford engagement was formally dissolved through a private communication between Lord Ashford's solicitor and the Dukes, with a compensatory arrangement that satisfied the legal obligations of the original document without binding either family to the marriage it had been designed to produce. Lady Harriet departed for her dower house in Somerset 3 days later, with the footman and the personal maid, and the contained expression of a woman who has revised her assessment of a situation and is not yet prepared to say so aloud. Eleanor had packed her trunk on the morning of the 16th. She had addressed a letter to Mrs. Pottle, thanking her, which was the correct form. She had carried the seal in her pocket all night and set it on the dressing table that morning and looked at it for a long time, and then put it back. She was in the corridor outside the nursery, her trunk at the top of the stairs, when she heard Thomas from inside, and heard Agnes say something low and soothing, and heard Thomas say, "Is Miss Eleanor going?" in the careful, quiet voice he used for important questions. She did not hear Agnes's answer. She stood in the corridor and closed her eyes for a moment, and thought about her father, and about what it cost to speak in rooms that did not ask you to, and about whether the cost was different when the speaking was not for herself, but because the truth was simply there, and she was the only one in the room who had seen it, and could not, in the end, see it in silence. The door to the corridor opened, and it was not Agnes. Edward Cavendish stood in the doorway of his son's nursery with his coat off and his cravat loosened, as he had stood 2 weeks before, and he looked at her and at the trunk at the top of the stairs with the same composed expression that contained more than it showed, which she had come to understand was not coldness. "Mrs. Pottle has indicated you are to leave today," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment. "That instruction was given by my mother," he said. "It does not stand." She looked at him. He looked at her, steadily, in the manner of a man who had spent 3 years avoiding the act of wanting things, and had arrived, by some route she had not witnessed in its entirety, at the other side of that avoidance. "There is a position," he said, "in the management of the household correspondence. Mrs. Pottle requires assistance." He paused. "It is a position that would benefit from a person who reads quickly and understands what she reads." Eleanor held the seal in her closed fist and thought about what her father had never been given, which was the room to speak, and someone with the standing to hear her. "I would require," she said carefully, "to understand the terms." "The terms are straightforward," he said. "You stay. We discuss the terms as required." He looked at the trunk. Thomas would prefer it. It was not poetry. It was not the declaration of a man who had studied how to make such speeches. It was the plain articulation of a man who had decided something and was saying it without performance, and it was, for that reason, entirely legible. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He nodded, the small definitive nod of a man returning to business, and turned back to his son's room, and left the door slightly open behind him. Inside, she could hear Thomas asking if Miss Eleanor was staying, in the same careful voice, and she could hear the Duke say yes, quietly, in the voice she had learned to read, which was the voice he used when he meant what he said, without qualification. The autumn deepened over the weeks that followed. The leaves came fully down from the oaks along the drive, and the mornings grew cold enough that the first fire in the nursery grate became a daily fixture rather than an occasion. Thomas's cough resolved, as coughs did when the cold was dry rather than damp, and he had moved on from ships to a volume on natural history that he approached with the methodical interest of a child who intended to understand things properly. Eleanor had taken on the household correspondence in the mornings and returned to other duties in the afternoons, and had found that the work suited her in the way that work suited a person when it was work she was built for. Mrs. Pottle had not mentioned the previous arrangement again, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The house settled into the rhythms of late autumn with the particular quiet of a place that has been through something and is now simply itself. She was in the library on a Tuesday morning in November, sorting the week's correspondence into categories that Mr. Fenwick would require for his next visit, when she heard the door. She did not turn with urgency. She had stopped turning with urgency. He set a cup of tea on the corner of the correspondence table and said nothing, which was a form of saying something. She looked at the cup and then at the column of correspondence, and picked up the cup and continued sorting. He sat down in the chair across the table, the same chair he had occupied intermittently over the preceding weeks in the particular way of a man who was slowly learning to occupy a room without procedure, and opened a letter from the estate manager. The library was cold and lit well, and carried the smell of old leather and ink, and the faint dampness of autumn coming in at the window frames. And the fire Mrs. Pottle had sent a footman to lay was burning steadily in the grate, and doing its best against the November morning. Eleanor turned the seal over in the fingers of her free hand, underneath the table where it could not be seen. She had carried it for 6 weeks, and had not put it down. She suspected she would carry it for some time more, not as a reminder of what she had seen, but as a reminder of the moment she had decided that what she had seen was her business. Because the truth of what was in that room had been hers, whether the room intended it or not. She set the next letter on the correspondence pile, and picked up the cup and drank from it. And the fire burned, and November moved in its quiet way through the great house, and outside the library window, the last of the leaves let go, and the oaks along the drive stood clear against the gray sky, clean and particular in the way that only stripped trees were, showing exactly what they were made of.